Welcome, my night travelers. Tonight, we walk into a world where beauty glittered brighter than reason, and fashion, quite literally, killed. In every age, humans have paid the price for beauty, but few realize how high that price once was. Arsenic sewn into gowns, lead painted onto skin, and corsets that crushed lungs and hearts. This is the story of fashion's deadliest obsessions, and it begins in the dim candlelight of the 19th century, where beauty met poison. London, 1861. The gaslights shimmered against polished marble floors. The air smelled of perfume and sweat, and beneath it, a faint metallic tang no one dared question. Every lady in the ballroom glowed with color: emerald greens, sapphire blues, crimson reds. But one woman, Miss Isabella Thorndale, shone brightest of all. Her gown was unlike any other, a vivid green so radiant that the crowd whispered its name in envy: Sheely's green, the color of envy itself. She laughed, she danced, she twirled under chandeliers, not knowing her dress was coated in arsenic. Each step she took, each brush of her gown released invisible dust, a slow, elegant cloud of death. When the night ended, Isabella's lips were pale. By morning, she was gone. The papers blamed an unknown illness. The truth, her beauty had killed her. The world adored that green. Fashion magazines praised it. Even wallpaper manufacturers used it. But few realized that the dye's creator, Carl Wilhelm Scheele, welcome, night travelers. Step softly into the wardrobe of history, where silk whispers, powders glimmer, and every ribbon is tied with a little thread of doom. Tonight's story opens beneath gaslit chandeliers and closes where the morgue's lamps burn low. Beauty will shimmer, status will beckon, but each elegant breath will cost a little more life than the last. If you've ever wondered how fashion could kill without leaving fingerprints, stay close. We're about to waltz with a dress that poisons, a mirror that lies, and a heartbeat bound too tightly to be heard. The doors of the ballroom yawn open, and a tide of color rolls in. Blues as bright as fresh bruises, whites like the belly of an eel, and a green so vivid it seems painted with jungle lightning. The orchestra begins. The young, the rich, the hopeful spin into patterns as old as ambition. Among them glides a woman whose gown does not merely catch the light. Her gown drinks it, bends it, and throws it back as if the cloth itself is alive. Envy has a hue, and this is it. People say the dye is a marvel, a miracle, a triumph of science at last made wearable. They do not say what it is made of. They do not ask. She dances until the tiny bones of her feet ache. She laughs until her throat stings like it's been scratched by invisible claws. Somewhere between the fourth and fifth waltz, a headache flares behind her eyes, a bright, unreasonable star. She ignores it. What is pain against the pleasure of being seen? The floor smells faintly of polish, orange peel, and hot iron. Her skin is warm. Her lips look pale in the mirrors that fringe the hall. But that is only the light, she tells herself. Only the light.
They part at midnight, as people always do, from any night that thinks itself immortal. The silk sighs downstairs, the servants sweep away the footprints, and the chandeliers cool with little ticks like delicate clocks. Our lady's coach rolls through damp streets. She touches her throat because the laugh has left a burn there. When she reaches home, she is suddenly very, very tired. 1 pin, 2, 3. The dress relaxes. Threads release dust so fine it moves like smoke. She inhales it as easily as a dream. She sleeps. She doesn't wake. In the morning, the mirror is unkind. A maid, unsure, touches the bodice, and when she lifts her fingers to her nose, she swears she can smell metal. What does metal smell like on a living person? Fear, if it had an odor. The doctor arrives with a bag and a reputation. He purses his mouth, feels for a pulse that is practicing its goodbyes, and says something vague about the air, about nerves, about the mysterious delicacy of ladies who take the world too earnestly. He does not stroke the fabric. He does not ask who dyed it. He leaves with polite condolences. A carriage grinds away. Somewhere a bell tolls. Outside the window, the city continues in its hundreds of thousands of breaths, taking in what the century has to offer. Now, lean closer. Keep your voice low, as if we were speaking in a dressing room where walls have ears and the gowns are listening. That green, oh yes, the luminous green, isn't a color so much as a verdict. It was born in the bright impatience of laboratories and workshops that believed every problem had a recipe, and every recipe could be pinned to a profit. Pigments like this one made parlors glow, toyed with wallpaper, flirted with ribbons, and finally slid into dresses that gathered the night against every moving body. No crime scene, no weapon, only a dust that loves the tender insides of you. Throat, lungs, eyes, blood. The century is proud of itself. It has engines. It has steam. It has glass you can bend into miracles. It has men in spectacles who name things with precision and then sell them by the spool. Fashion houses learn quickly. One hue more intense than the next, one shine brighter than last season, one rumor of royalty wrapped around your waist. The customers, eager and perfectly reasonable, believe that a thing with a clean label must be safe. And who would suspect danger in a color that looks like new leaves after rain? You could say the city was the accomplice. Streets swallowed secrets as quickly as they swallowed rain. Factories coughed up night-colored smoke, and the river drank what they gave it without complaint. In a workroom, not so far from the ballroom, a girl rubs powder into cloth. Her fingernails dyed a strange green that stains the cuticles. Some nights she goes home with a nosebleed that tastes like tin. Her supervisor tells her not to be dramatic. Fashion is a calling, he says, and the finest gowns require devotion. She nods and keeps working, because rent is merciless, and an empty belly doesn't care about elegance. The girl has never been to a ball, but the ball, in a way, visits her every day in the dust that settles on her tongue.
Shall we visit a parlor where the walls bloom in the same fatal hue? Wallpaper that looks like spring's first shout. Guests inhale compliments and something else. Something that sharpens the air the way a knife sharpens attention. The host has been suffering curious ailments, a rash that will not choose a shape, a cough that doesn't obey seasons, a deep, treacherous tiredness. Doctors, polite as ever, prefer to locate the disease inside the patient rather than the paint. The thought that the room itself might be starving its occupants doesn't feel modern enough to accept. Modernity prefers neat villains, a fever you can name, a bacillus you can draw. It is less fond of the idea that beauty, purchased and papered, decides to harvest you grain by grain. If the dress was the first act, the mirror is the second.
powder sits in porcelain bowls like snow sifted from a fairy tale. It promises to banish shine, erase pores, mute every human reminder that you are made of water and salt. The mirror is happy to cooperate. Women pat a fine dust across their faces, purring when it blurs fatigue and overrules blemishes. They carry the smell of violets wherever they go, because it is added to the powder to reassure them they are not committing an offense against nature. The mirror nods, yes, yes, you look flawless. It does not mention the headaches, the strange taste when you swallow, the tender gums that bleed a little when you smile too wide. It is not the mirror's job to tell the truth, only to reflect it fashionably. A gentleman, too, plays his part. His collar is starched to severity, his hair neat with pomade that glitters faintly. He admires the green of his beloved's gown. He whispers that the color could cut glass, it is so sharp. He means it as a compliment. Later, when she winces and presses fingers to her temples, he tells her she mustn't dance so hard next time. He is not unkind. He is only trained by a world that can't imagine the costume is rehearsing a murder. Listen to the city again. Carriages, hooves, men hawking newspapers. Between the headlines, another story. A seamstress with a stubborn cough. A child who sleeps fitfully in a nursery papered with emerald vines. A lady with flaking eyelids who discreetly cancels her engagements. These are ordinary tragedies, the kind that never earn a headline, because they don't explode. They whisper. The orchestra plays on, even after the most beautiful girl in the room is carried quietly from it. There are always a few who notice earlier than the rest. A housemaid who keeps her handkerchief over her mouth when she shakes out the mistress's gown. A doctor who draws a line in his notebook connecting wallpaper to asthma. A printer who refuses to set an advertisement for a dye because his brother grew sick making it. Their warnings are soft at first, because soft is what the age will tolerate from people without power. But soft shapes can carve stone if you give them enough time. Eventually, a whisper becomes a conversation, and the conversation forces a reckoning. Not all inventions are progress, not every shimmer is a blessing. But tonight, the reckoning is still a rumor, and the dress is still legal, and the powder still sold in boxes with swans and roses on the lid. The funeral is tasteful, as befits taste itself. White lilies, black gloves, a pastor who speaks of angels as if they were seamstresses with wings. The dead woman's friends wear subdued colors that leach the room of life. They murmur about fragility, about the season, about one's constitution. No one dares blame the gown. It lies folded, smug, in a drawer that doesn't know it is a coffin.
In the weeks that follow, a few of the guests develop symptoms they cannot name. One man dreams of green rain and wakes with his pillow damp from tears his body made without permission. A child draws a lady in a bright dress and colors the mouth the same shade because the child thinks beauty should match beauty. The drawing is lovely, the child's fingers are stained. Let us step outside for a breath of honest air. Fog creeps along the river, barges nose through like old crocodiles. The city's breath is not entirely honest, nothing here is, but it is less intimate than a powdered throat or a laced rib cage. A worker leans on a railing and coughs until he sees stars, then lights a cigarette to comfort himself with something familiar. He does not know he shares a kinship with a duchess whose lungs are learning the same painful song. Fashion has always been democracy's cruelest costume. It pretends to separate classes even as it binds them with the same invisible thread. You may ask, why didn't they stop? Why didn't a lady fling open her wardrobe, let the poisonous silks fall like shed skins, and walk out wrapped only in health? Because fashion is rarely about clothes. It is a story you tell the world so the world will tell you a story back. It is a passport stamped with envy and access. To surrender it is to admit that you never needed it, and very few hearts are strong enough to make that confession. Danger, if it arrives dressed as a compliment, is always granted an extra hour at the party. Still, fear learns to speak.
Somewhere, a pamphlet warns in bristling sentences that bright green is not a color, but a coffin. Somewhere, a society matron whispers to her dressmaker, "Not that shade, not this season, I beg you." Other shades rise to take its place, sober blues, respectable grays, as if color itself were apologizing. But fashion does not apologize. It pivots. It invents fresh perils to keep pace with our desire to be admired. And that desire has more rooms. A corset waits on its stand like a patient predator. It is beautiful in the way traps are beautiful, all gleam and geometry. Laces whisper through eyelets. A rib of whalebone considers the ribs of a girl still deciding what kind of breath she plans to take in this world. But that is another chapter's confession. Tonight, let the fabric that glows like venom finish its lesson. The dress, you see, was never just cloth. It was an argument about the future made in a language of color and cut. The future answered, "Give me your comfort, your safety, your next decade, and I will make you unforgettable for a night." Most of us, if we are honest, have considered that bargain. The young woman in the ballroom did not know the terms. She thought the price had already been paid at the shop counter. She didn't know that some prices are collected later, quietly, after the music stops. So remember her, not as a cautionary tale pinned like a moth beneath glass, but as a companion. Remember the maid who shook the gown and coughed into her sleeve. Remember the little girl who colored the mouth the same green as the dress. Remember the doctor with his neat mustache who suspected and could not prove. And remember the city which keeps secrets until the wind scrapes them loose.
Welcome to fashion's shadow decade, where elegance sharpened itself into a blade and smiled while you bled. Tonight we learned how a color could haunt lungs and a hem could trail a ghost. Next, we will touch the powders that promised perfection and salted the bloodstream with a slow, glittering harm. And then the laces that tightened until prayers became whispers and whispers became silence. For now, close the wardrobe. Let the silk settle. And when you pass a shop window glowing with something you cannot look away from, ask yourself one question in the hush behind your heartbeat. What does it cost to be this beautiful, and who will pay? The story of deadly fashion never ends with a single gown. If the green dress was a poison you could wear, the next horror was a poison you could become. A woman's face, in the centuries before photography and filters, was her status. Pale skin meant wealth. It meant you never labored under the sun. It meant you were closer to heaven than to the soil. And to chase that illusion, the world created a weapon disguised as beauty: white lead. Imagine the morning ritual: a mirror framed in gold, a brush of swan feathers, a small jar that gleams with promise. The label calls it Venetian ceruse, a powder finer than snow, used by queens and courtesans. Inside it, a mixture of vinegar and ground lead carbonate. The moment it touches skin, it smooths the pores, hides the freckles, erases the nights of sleepless worry. The mirror smiles. The woman smiles back. The poison smiles wider. In Elizabethan courts, this pale glow was everything. Portraits of the queen herself show a face that glitters almost like marble, ageless, divine. Behind the paint, though, her skin cracked and burned. Sores formed beneath the powder. Her hair thinned, her teeth loosened. But the court only saw the mask. To them, she was the virgin queen, untouched by age or decay. And so, courtiers copied her. They too brushed on the death that made them desirable. The poison was patient. It did not kill in an hour. It took years, whispering in the blood, softening the bones, clouding the mind. The cheeks flushed faintly, not from youth, but from lead. The eyes shimmered not from life, but from fever. And when the body finally surrendered, when tremors shook the hands that once painted the face, it was said the poor soul had succumbed to nerves. Few connected the sickness to the beauty they all praised.
There was another trick to keep the illusion intact. The powder, when mixed with vinegar and oil, created a paste. It sealed the skin so tightly that it could no longer breathe. Underneath, sweat gathered. Rot began. When it peeled, they called it the price of glamour. They would scrape the old layer away and spread a new one, brighter, thicker, more perfect. The same ritual every day. Apply, smile, decay. Repeat. Even when doctors began to whisper warnings, fashion did not listen. Merchants rebranded the poison. Lily white, they called it. Pearl bloom. They sold it in France, in Italy, in the new cities of America. Every language found a beautiful name for slow death. The servants, too, played their part in this theater. They mixed the powders by hand, stirring them in shallow bowls until the dust rose into the air. Many coughed until their lungs were raw. They went home at night dizzy, their fingers numb, their lips pale. No one asked why. Beauty, after all, demanded sacrifice. And then there were the perfumes, those delicate bottles on every vanity, filled with alcohol and essence, but also mercury and arsenic to fix the scent. The very breath that carried elegance was another dose of poison. Fashion had colonized not just the skin, but the air itself. By the late 18th century, the truth could no longer be ignored. A few physicians dared to publish papers about the mysterious paralysis of fashionable women. They spoke of blackened gums, of madness that came like a fog. Some noble families quietly buried daughters who had simply faded away. The shops replaced lead with euphemisms, refined mineral, alabaster powder. The lie continued, only more politely. In Japan, China, even India, similar obsessions grew. Rice powders, mercury creams, and bleaching concoctions promised purity. The fairer your face, the more doors opened. Across cultures, the message was identical. The closer you looked to the dead, the more alive you seemed in society's eyes. There's a cruel poetry in that, isn't there? The very image of life, pale, flawless, eternal, built from the ingredients of death. Imagine the vanity of a noblewoman one last time. Candles flicker on bottles and brushes. Her maid unseals the jar. The powder rises, fine as smoke. She breathes it in and sighs, half pleasure, half habit. The mirror gleams with approval. Beneath her skin, the lead begins its work again, slow and certain. Centuries later, archaeologists will open coffins and find traces of lead deep in the bones, proof that beauty left its signature in the marrow. They will marvel at how devoted the living once were to their masks.
So, if the first chapter was about color that killed, this one is about light itself, the light that blinded, that burned from within, the deadly white face of perfection. And as the mirror fogs with breath, another figure waits behind it, the corset maker, measuring waists, pulling strings tighter. That's where our story goes next, into the iron cage that called itself elegance, the century that danced in poisoned dresses and powdered its face with death was not yet finished. There was still the matter of the body itself, its shape, its obedience, its ability to conform to a fantasy so strict that it squeezed the life from the ribs. This chapter begins in the stillness of a dressing chamber, where satin whispers against bone and hands pull at laces until prayer turns into silence. The corset, that most elegant of inventions, was not clothing at all. It was a contract written in whalebone and pain. Morning light falls across the mirror. A maid stands behind her mistress, her fingers already numb from the strain. The lady lifts her arms slightly, as if preparing for flight, and the first tug begins. The fabric stiffens around her like armor.
The laces draw in, inch by inch, whispering promises of beauty and control. Tighter, she says, always tighter. Her ribs yield first, then her lungs. The breath that once moved freely now shudders like a trapped bird. She smiles faintly. It is the smile of someone who has learned to hide discomfort behind grace. Fashion called it refinement. Doctors called it constriction sickness. The truth lay somewhere between the two, a slow rearrangement of anatomy in the name of elegance. The ideal waist was said to be 13 inches. 13! Unlucky even then. The measurements were not chosen by comfort or sense, but by fantasy. And fantasy rarely cared if its victims could breathe. Underneath the ball gowns of Europe, under the high collars of the Victorian age, an entire generation of women lived in cages of their own making. Metal, whalebone, ivory, steel. They were the bones beneath the bones. The ribs deformed, the stomach migrated upward, the liver compressed until it bore the marks of the corset stays, visible even after death. Doctors who dissected fashionable women in the 1800s often found organs folded and scarred like pressed flowers. Yet still the advertisements claimed health benefits. Supports posture, aids digestion, improves figure. There is a dark genius in that lie. The corset did support posture, like a brace supports a broken limb. It did aid digestion by halting it entirely, and it improved the figure until the figure was no longer human, but an hourglass sculpted by suffering. Women fainted so often that fainting itself became fashionable. Parlors were furnished with fainting couches, as if swooning were merely another form of etiquette. Imagine the ballroom again, that eternal stage where fashion commits its crimes under chandeliers. The music swells, but the air is thin. A lady clutches her fan not to flirt, but to survive. Each breath is rationed. Her smile is carved, her waist a promise she cannot keep. Behind her, the maid who laced her into that shape stands unnoticed, her own lungs grateful for every full breath. Between them stretches a hierarchy of pain. One performs it for admiration, the other for employment.
By the late 19th century, the medical community began to murmur. X-rays, new, uncanny windows into the flesh, revealed the truth. Skeletons twisted like question marks. Ribs bent inward, pressing against hearts and lungs. Yet fashion magazines refused to print the evidence. Photographs were retouched. The myth of beauty was more profitable than the reality of suffocation. A few women rebelled. The rational dress movement was born, a campaign of doctors, writers, and defiant daughters who declared that comfort could be beautiful too. They called for loose gowns, for waists that breathed, for a life without steel. But society laughed. Men scoffed that women were abandoning refinement. Women whispered that freedom looked unfashionable. And so, the laces remained. In one famous case, a duchess collapsed during an opera in 1893. The cause, newspapers reported, was overexcitement. Her doctor told another story. Her ribs had punctured her lung when she leaned forward to applaud. The tragedy was whispered about for months, yet corset shops saw no decline. The lesson was clear. Death could not compete with style. Even in the working classes, where women could not afford elaborate stays, cheaper versions appeared: canvas, leather, rope. The poor copied the habits of the rich, believing the shape would grant them respectability. And so the disease spread downward through society like all beautiful poisons do. A corset was more than fashion. It was discipline. It was a language that said, your body must never betray you. It must never spill or sag or sigh. To be elegant was to be silent, even inside your own skin. The breathing that marked you as alive became a weakness to be hidden. At night, when the maids unfastened the laces, the air rushed in with a sound like sobbing. Women stood before mirrors, their waists mottled red and purple, the grooves of the stays etched deep as scars. They would promise themselves relief, and yet by morning they returned to the ritual. The corset was not merely something they wore, it was something that wore them. When the 20th century arrived and wars began to reshape the world, the corset finally began to loosen its grip. Metal was needed for weapons, not waists. Fabric rationing and women's labor forced practicality into fashion. For the first time in centuries, women could breathe freely, not as an indulgence, but as necessity. But freedom, like breath, is easily forgotten. Within a few decades, girdles, waist trainers, and plastic shaping garments replaced the old steel bones. The names changed, but the message stayed the same. The natural body must always apologize. So remember this. Fashion rarely dies. It transforms. It reappears with new materials, new slogans, new influencers selling the same cage in a softer voice. Today's shapewear commercials are written in the same language as the corset makers of the past. Only the vocabulary of pain has changed. The corset promised elegance and delivered obedience. It taught a civilization how to confuse restraint with grace. And that lesson lingers in every mirror where someone still asks, "Am I beautiful enough to hurt for it?" Next, we'll open the drawer where elegance met deception again, not in fabric, but in fragrance. The perfumes that gilded air with poison, the powders that burned from within. The chapter of beauty's breath, steeped in death.
Close your eyes for a moment. Breathe in. What do you smell? Jasmine, rose, amber, must, the language of desire. But in the parlors and boudoirs of the 18th and 19th centuries, each breath carried something else too, a thin, invisible thread of poison. Perfume was meant to enchant, to seduce, to declare one's class before a word was spoken. Yet behind every delicate scent lay mercury, arsenic, benzene, and lead. Alchemy turned lethal. Beauty, once again, was killing softly. Perfume had been a necessity since the Middle Ages, when cities reeked of decay and soap was a luxury. The rich masked the stench of unwashed streets with clouds of scent so dense they left trails behind like spirits. But as chemistry advanced, perfumers began to play God. They sought the perfect blend, stronger, longer lasting, irresistible. Natural oils were fickle, expensive, and faint. Synthetic chemistry promised permanence. It delivered death. Picture a dressing table in Paris, 1850. Bottles of cut glass catch the morning light, each stoppered with gold. A lady leans in, uncorks one, and the room blooms with fragrance. Violet, perhaps, or lilac. What she doesn't see is the silent shimmer of mercury vapor rising with it. The same element once used by hatters to cure fur, now distilled into elegance. Inhaling it gave the scent its staying power. It also stole memories, ruined lungs, and quickened madness. Mad as a hatter wasn't only for the men in workshops, it was for the women who wore their work. Other concoctions used arsenic as a fixative. It made perfume cling to the skin, to the folds of gowns, to the pulse points on the neck.
The wearer became a moving altar of toxins. Her suitors leaned closer, entranced, breathing in the same fumes that hollowed her blood cells one sigh at a time. To love her was to share her slow suicide. To complement her fragrance was to inhale her funeral. Perfume bottles became status symbols. The more ornate the glass, the deadlier the secret it hid. Some were shaped like hearts, others like daggers or cherubs. Inside, mixtures of musk and chemical solvents waited to burn the flesh beneath jewelry. Skin rashes were considered the mark of sophistication, proof that one's perfume was strong enough to matter. Women dabbed scent on wrists, behind ears, at the hollow of the throat. These were the pulse points of mortality. The tragedy deepened in the factories. The perfumers' apprentices, mostly young girls, worked with bare hands and no ventilation. They mixed tinctures of benzene and mercury salts, stirring until dizzy. Some began to lose hair. Others developed tremors so fierce they could no longer hold a brush. When they complained, their supervisors blamed nerves or hysteria. Beauty has its price, they were told, and so they paid it in silence.
Even men were not spared. In Victorian England, gentlemen scented their handkerchiefs with colognes laced with ethanol and lead acetate. The more he applied, the more refined he appeared. The smell lingered long after the mind began to fog. The age called it distemper. Science, centuries later, called it heavy metal poisoning. Not every perfume killed instantly. Most murders take time. The poisons accumulated in marrow, in liver, in breath. The same scent that made a woman unforgettable could make her unrecognizable within a few years. Pallor replaced glow. Lethargy replaced laughter. Madness replaced charm. Yet the bottles kept selling, and new scents appeared every season. Essence of innocence, eternal spring, whisper of heaven. How many deaths can you hide behind a name? But the deadliest part of all was not the chemical, it was the illusion. Perfume promised power. It gave a woman the ability to command a room without speaking. In a world that kept her silent, fragrance was her rebellion. She did not know the rebellion was already killing her. The irony is almost divine. The very air she used to claim freedom became the cage that trapped her lungs. By the dawn of the 20th century, whispers began to spread. Doctors linked mysterious fevers and paralysis to cosmetics and perfumes. A few manufacturers quietly replaced mercury with alcohol, arsenic with aldehydes. They called it modern chemistry, a triumph of progress. Yet even the modern replacements came with dangers: benzene, toluene, formaldehyde, ghosts in new masks. The industry learned how to rename its poisons faster than science could expose them. Today, perfume still clings to that contradiction. We spray it on skin, on clothes, into the air we breathe. We rarely read the fine print. We trust that the bottle on the counter is harmless because it glitters beneath safe light. But if you listen closely, beneath the citrus and vanilla, you can still smell history's echo, the faint metallic sweetness of the poisons that came before. In the end, scent is memory. The perfumes of the past remind us that beauty has always borrowed from the language of decay. Every breath carries both seduction and warning. When the next fragrance ad promises eternity in the bottle, remember what eternity once meant. It was the kind of forever that began with a single perfumed breath and ended when the lungs forgot how to take another. Next, the story moves from air to light, from perfume to fabric once more. The shimmer of silk that carried disease, and the glittering gowns woven with death.
The story continues in the shimmer of candlelight and the slow rustle of silk. To the eye,
silk was perfection. Soft as moonlight, strong as spider's web, and so lustrous that a single gown could turn an ordinary evening into legend. But beauty, as always, came at a price unseen. Behind every fold of satin and every ribbon of lace, another silent killer waited. The factories that bred fever, the dyes that rotted flesh, and the insects that turned life into labor. Let's begin in Lyon, France, 1750. The city hums with looms, the air trembles with the constant thudding of machines. Silk threads glisten like cobwebs, and the streets themselves seem to breathe color. But that color was made not of art, but of arsenic, mercury, and bile. The dyers stand barefoot in vats of chemical broth, their skins stained green and red, their hands blistered raw. The apprentices cough into their sleeves, their lungs black with soot and steam. Every bolt of cloth they finish leaves another scar behind. To wear silk was to wear their pain. Each gown carried the sweat and sickness of those who wove it. But society didn't see that. The nobles only saw shine, liquid light that whispered wealth. The poorer classes saw opportunity. And so, the poison spread. Across the sea, in England, the story turned crueler still. The process of making silk gloves and ribbons required mercuric nitrate to soften the fibers. The vapors crept through workshops, dulling senses, trembling hands. The workers called it the shakes. Their smiles became stiff, their skin pale, their eyes too bright. They called the sickness the trembling madness of the silk girls. Doctors called it erythism. The merchants called it an unfortunate necessity. And then there were the cocoons themselves, the tiny laborers of fashion. Millions of silkworms bred, boiled alive, their work harvested before they could ever become what nature intended. The same species that could have flown was turned into thread. Beauty demanded silence, even from the creatures that made it. The women who wore the gowns never thought about this. How could they? Their corsets inched, their perfumes gleamed, their gloves shone faintly under lamplight. Silk was status, something to be caressed, envied, flaunted. Yet the silk that touched their throats often carried invisible contagion. The dyes contained copper arsenite, lead chromate, and mercury sulfide, substances so toxic they could blister the skin through sweat. In the heat of the ballroom, death mingled with perfume.
One famous case unfolded in 1839. Lady Margaret C., a socialite in Vienna, ordered a new gown for the spring season. Ivory silk overlaid with delicate blue. The color was achieved with a new synthetic dye known as Paris blue, mixed with arsenic salts. Within hours of wearing it, she developed nausea and dizziness. By morning, her hands trembled uncontrollably. The servants who brushed the skirt also fell ill. The doctor blamed vapors. The dressmaker blamed humidity. No one blamed the dye. And yet evidence was everywhere. When the factories along the Seine or the Thames flushed their dye vats, the rivers turned unnatural shades of purple, green, and crimson. Fish floated to the surface, their gills scarlet with poison. Workers living along those banks grew ill, their children born weak or blind. The price of beauty was written in water. But fashion refused to look down. It looked forward, to innovation, to speed, to industry. When synthetic aniline dyes arrived in the 1850s, everyone cheered. At last, color without cost, or so they thought. Aniline was made from coal tar, a new miracle of chemistry. But the fumes were toxic. Factory girls who handled the dyes developed sores that glowed faintly blue under lamplight. They joked that they were becoming as fashionable as the gowns they made. Some of them coughed blood within months. Meanwhile, doctors began to notice something strange among the elite. Rashes, tumors, respiratory illness that had no clear origin.
They called it the disease of fashion. Letters to medical journals warned, "Do not mistake luxury for safety." Still, the shops on Bond Street and the Palais Royal flourished. Silk was wealth, and wealth was purity. No one wished to see the filth beneath the shine. There is something ghostly about silk, even now. It moves with its own life, catching light in ways cotton never can. It seems alive, but it is the life of something sacrificed. A worm, a worker, a river. Every thread hums with the quiet pulse of what was taken to make it. When you touch it, you can almost feel the faint heat of the boiling pot where it began. The irony is almost poetic. The very fabric that symbolized refinement was born from suffering. Each smooth gown that swirled through royal halls carried the fingerprints of the poor, the burned, the nameless. Each sheen of beauty was bought with blindness, fever, and silence.
By the early 20th century, silk's empire began to weaken. Rayon, artificial silk, arrived, promising a future free of cruelty and cost. But progress never forgets its habits. The chemicals used to make rayon were just as deadly: carbon disulfide and sulfuric acid. The new workers fell into madness and tremors just as the old ones had. The material changed, but the sickness stayed. And so silk became another chapter in humanity's long romance with beautiful death. We chase shimmer, and shimmer answers. It whispers, "Wear me, touch me, die for me." When the last loom falls silent, the city sleeps, but the fibers still gleam in the dark, alive with memory. The dresses are preserved in museums now, untouched, immaculate. But if you lean close enough, beneath the glass, you might still smell the faint tang of metal, the ghost of arsenic, the sigh of a girl who once coughed into her sleeve and kept working. Because beauty never disappears. It only changes its costume. And as the new century approached, fashion found a new obsession. Not silk, not color, not powder, but light itself. A glow that would captivate the modern world. A glow that came from radiation. Next, we open the story of the women who painted their beauty with the shimmer of death, the Radium Girls. The 20th century dawned like a promise. Electricity was no longer a miracle. It was modern life. Factories hummed, cities glittered, and science seemed capable of anything. Even beauty began to glow. And nowhere was that glow more seductive or more deadly than in the shimmer of radium. It began innocently enough. In 1898, Marie and Pierre Curie isolated a new element from pitchblende, a mineral that seemed to pulse with its own light. They named it radium, from the Latin radius, meaning ray. It glowed faintly green in the dark, cold and pure, a fragment of the stars made earthly. Scientists hailed it as the energy of the future. Industry saw something else: money. Soon the miracle mineral found its way into everything: medicines, tonics, toothpaste, even chocolate. But the fashion world, always hungry for light, turned it into a sensation. Radium silk, radium face cream, radium rouge. A product that literally glowed in candlelight became the height of luxury. If your gown shimmered faintly at night, you were not merely elegant, you were radiant. Factories sprang up across Europe and America to meet the demand. In the United States, one of the most famous stood in Orange, New Jersey, the United States Radium Corporation. There, hundreds of young women painted luminous dials on watches and instruments, using a special paint called Undark. They were told it was harmless. They were told
to shape their brushes to a perfect point with their lips. Lip, dip, paint. That was the rhythm. Every few seconds, the girls would lick their brushes, dip them into the glowing mixture of zinc sulfide and radium salts, and trace delicate numerals across the faces of clocks. At night, they would laugh as their dresses glowed faintly, their hair shimmering like fairy dust. Some painted their teeth to make their smiles sparkle in the dark. They were called the Ghost Girls. What no one told them was that the glow came at the cost of their bones. Radium behaves like calcium. It settles into the skeleton. Once inside, it never leaves. It burns from within, destroying marrow, eating the jaw from the inside out. The first symptoms were strange: toothaches, headaches, fatigue. Then the jawbones softened. Dentists, unaware of the real cause, pulled teeth, and the wounds refused to heal. Flesh dissolved, bone crumbled. Their breath began to smell faintly metallic, radiation leaking from within. Doctors called it radium necrosis. The newspapers called it a tragedy. The company called it coincidence. But the women knew better. They began to die one by one, glowing faintly even in their coffins. One of them, Grace Fryer, refused to vanish quietly. Though bedridden and in agony, she began a legal battle against the corporation that had poisoned her. In 1927, she and 5 others became the faces of a landmark case, the Radium Girls trial. Their bones were so radioactive, they made photographic plates fog just by lying nearby. The court ruled in their favor, setting the stage for the first real workplace safety laws in history. But for many, it came too late. The irony was cruel. The very element that killed them was being sold as beauty's next miracle. Ads promised eternal youth, glowing skin, energy from within. If it shines, the magazine said, it must be good. Women massaged radium cream into their faces, misting themselves with radioactive powders that promised to revive the complexion. Their cheeks did glow at first. Later, that glow was replaced by sores that refused to heal, by skin that thinned and wept. Even the wealthy were not spared. One of the most famous victims was Eben Byers, a steel magnate who drank radium-laced water every day, convinced it improved his health. By the time he died in 1932, his jaw had disintegrated entirely. The newspaper summed it up with chilling brevity. The radium water worked fine until his jaw came off. But the fashion industry was slow to repent. Radium remained a selling point well into the 1930s. Perfumes promised a radiant scent. Hair tonics claimed to energize follicles. The glow of modernity was irresistible, and so the lie continued, flickering in the dark. It is tempting to think of the Radium Girls as martyrs of science, but they were something else too, martyrs of beauty. They wanted the same things that all their sisters in silk and powder had wanted: to shine, to be admired, to belong to an age of wonder. The world told them that glow equaled glamour, that light itself could be worn like jewelry. No one told them light could kill. Years later, when the factories closed and the lawsuits faded, the graves of those women still shimmered faintly. Even now, more than a century later, their bones release tiny pulses of radiation, a ghostly testimony to the century's obsession with brightness.
Radium taught humanity a cruel truth. Progress is a double-edged light. It illuminates the path forward, but it burns everything it touches. The same glow that once marked beauty on a woman's cheek now marks danger on a laboratory wall. And yet, history moves in circles. The hunger to shine, to glow, to radiate, to defy nature has never left us. We no longer use radium, but we chase light in other ways. Ultraviolet tans, laser whitening, chemical peels that burn in the name of perfection. The glow remains, only the poison has changed its name. So, as the lights of the roaring 20s dim and the shadows of the modern world gather, the story of fashion's deadly shimmer begins to shift again.
from the laboratories of light to the parlors of power. Next, we open the chapter of beauty's most secret killer, the world of toxic cosmetics and vanity unmasked. It starts, as always, with a mirror, a room dimly lit by morning light, a vanity lined with bottles and tins, each promising transformation, a powder for smoothness, a cream for youth, a lipstick for allure. The century that invented airplanes, cinema, and radio also perfected the art of selling death in shades of pink and red. By the 1920s, beauty was no longer the privilege of queens. It was democracy's new crown. Every woman could buy glamour for a few coins, could brush and dab and paint herself into a Hollywood dream. But the formulas inside those shining tubes were mixtures of lead, mercury, arsenic, and carmine, each ingredient a whisper from the grave. The most dangerous of them all was the lipstick, a weapon disguised as a smile. Manufacturers used lead oxide to intensify color and make the pigment last longer. It clung to the mouth like devotion, refused to fade, and slowly entered the bloodstream. Women complained of headaches, fatigue, trembling fingers. Some began to lose hair, others their memory. The newspapers never blamed the lipstick. They blamed nerves. They blamed hysteria. They blamed women for wanting to be beautiful. In Paris, a fashionable shade was nicknamed Love's Last Kiss. It was a deep crimson, bright even in candlelight, created with a compound known as vermilion, mercury sulfide. Each kiss carried a trace of madness. Artists once used the same pigment to paint saints and sinners. Now it sat on the mouths of the living, waiting to paint them pale. The creams were no kinder. Skin whiteners and blemish removers promised purity in porcelain jars. Inside was bichloride of mercury, a substance powerful enough to dissolve tissue. The first applications worked miracles. Blemishes vanished, freckles faded, cheeks gleamed like marble. But mercury does not heal. It hides. Beneath the glow, the skin thinned, cracked, and scarred. Many women wore veils not for modesty, but to conceal the burns beneath their beauty. Even powders carried their curses. The most luxurious brands contained zinc oxide, barium, and arsenic trioxide, the same poison that once silenced kings. The fine dust drifted into lungs with every breath, turning vanity into slow suffocation. By mid-century, some doctors could diagnose fashion simply by examining the nails, faint white lines of lead, known as Mies lines, the manicure of death. And then came the radioactive age, still glittering from the promise of radium. Beauty companies saw opportunity in the glow. Revigator creams, radiant night tonics, atomic youth serums, all boasting the vitality of radiation. The ads showed smiling women with light in their eyes, unaware that the light was already consuming them from within. One product, Thoro Radium Cream, claimed to tighten skin and awaken the cells. It did. It awakened them into chaos. Some users developed ulcerations so deep they could see the bone beneath. The company quietly rebranded. The bottles changed shape, but the formula remained. By the 1930s, a quiet panic began. Chemists and physicians finally spoke aloud what they had whispered for decades. Beauty is killing our women. Governments passed the first safety laws, demanding labels, banning mercury, limiting lead. But fashion was faster than law. For every ingredient banned, 2 new ones were invented, chemical cousins with softer names and the same cruel intentions. In the factories, girls continued to die.
The cosmetic workers who filled powder tins and poured rouge breathed the dust day after day. They developed what came to be known as the pink disease. Their skin flushed, their nerves on fire, their bodies trembling with toxic grace. The managers called it fatigue. The newspapers called it mystery illness. Only the graves told the truth. And yet, the world refused to stop. Hollywood shimmered with lacquered lips and silver screen skin. Magazine covers taught women how to contour, how to correct, how to conceal. Beauty became discipline. Imperfection became sin. Every jar and tube whispered the same gospel. You are not enough, but you could be if you buy one more color. By the 1950s, chemistry had evolved into a new god. Synthetic preservatives, plasticizers, and pigments replaced the old metals. They were safer, the experts said, though no one knew what safety meant anymore. Women traded mercury for formaldehyde, arsenic for parabens, lead for petroleum dyes. The poisons changed costumes, but the mirror stayed the same. The saddest part of this history is not the death toll, it is the devotion. Women did not use these products out of vanity, they used them out of hope. Hope that beauty meant freedom, that youth meant control, that perfection meant love. The same hope that built empires, ruined queens, and filled graveyards with grace.
Even now, the legacy lingers. Modern makeup carries warning labels, but the hunger that created it is older than law. We still crave transformation. We still worship glow. And in every mirror, under every bright light, the ghosts of those first painted faces are watching, powdered, smiling, and forever waiting for the next generation to repeat the ritual. Because fashion never apologizes, it only reinvents. They called them treasures, symbols of wealth, status, love, rings that sealed marriages, necklaces that captured light, crowns that declared power. Yet beneath every glittering gem, beneath the gold and the silver, there lay something darker. For centuries, humanity mined the earth for beauty, and the earth, patient and vengeful, sent back poison in return. The story begins not in a palace, but in a mine. Deep beneath the mountains of Saxony, men worked by lantern light to dig out veins of shimmering silver. The air was thick with dust, dust that clung to lungs, that coated throats, that carried invisible death. Within years, the miners' faces grew hollow, their teeth loosened, their skin gray. They called it mountain sickness. Today, we call it arsenic poisoning. The silver they unearthed made jewelry for queens. The men who found it coughed themselves into graves. The beauty of jewelry is deceitful. To the eye, it's immortal. To the touch, it's cold perfection. But behind its polish lies a century of alchemy. Smelting, fusing, gilding, all processes steeped in mercury, lead, and cyanide. In the Renaissance, goldsmiths used mercury amalgamation to refine gold. The fumes turned their hands tremulous, their minds erratic. Apprentices went mad before 30. The masters hid their symptoms behind gloves and pride, while their wives quietly wept as their husbands forgot their own names. The jewels themselves were no safer for those who wore them. One of the deadliest ornaments in history was a green gemstone called copper arsenite, the same pigment that had once poisoned dresses. In the 19th century, it was cut and polished into beads, worn proudly around throats and wrists. The warmth of the skin released arsenic vapors. Women who wore them developed rashes that darkened, spread, and bled. The fashionable called it necklace sickness. The doctors called it chronic poisoning. The merchants called it a mild allergy and continued to sell the gems. And then there was the deadly beauty of pearls.
To create artificial pearls, craftsmen in the 18th and 19th centuries coated glass beads with a mixture known as essence d'orient, a shimmering liquid made from fish scales and ammonia mixed with mercury salts. The result was luminous, ethereal, but for the artisans who made them, each inhale was a death sentence. Their teeth fell out, their lungs scarred, their minds unraveled. The factory sparkled like heaven and stank like hell.
Yet nothing captured the world's morbid fascination like the cursed jewels. Stones said to bring death not by chemistry, but by fate. The Hope Diamond, deep blue and impossibly beautiful, passed from hand to hand like a whispered plague. Its owners met ruin, madness, and sudden ends. Kings fell. Heiresses died in scandal. The diamond outlived them all. Scientists dismiss curses as coincidence, but history rarely tells coincidences so neatly. Across cultures, gems were believed to hold power. Emeralds for protection, rubies for passion, opals for prophecy. But superstition cut both ways. Some stones were feared: the black diamond, the Delhi sapphire, the Koh-i-Noor. Each name written in blood, each legend built on pain. And always, somewhere behind the myth, the truth waited. The miners, the polishers, the goldsmiths who inhaled death so others could wear beauty. In Victorian England, jewelry met its most macabre form: mourning ornaments. Made from human hair, jet, or blackened glass, they were worn as tributes to the dead. But the jet was often coated with lead-based lacquer. The glass was painted with toxic dyes. Widows wore their grief like armor, unaware that the brooch at their throat was quietly leaching poison into their skin. Even the radiant gold of the modern age was not innocent. Gold plating required cyanide baths, liquid death that could kill with a single breath. Workshops smelled faintly of almonds, the scent of cyanide. Many goldsmiths died without warning, their hearts stopping mid-polish. Still, the work continued. The dead were buried. The jewelry was sold. The cycle glittered on. The early 20th century brought new dangers wrapped in progress. Cheap costume jewelry flooded markets, brass coated with lead, enamel glazed with uranium to create that irresistible yellow-green shine. Mothers bought earrings for their daughters, bracelets for their birthdays. They didn't know the pieces were radioactive. Decades later, scientists measuring antique jewelry found levels of radiation strong enough to trip Geiger counters. There is something deeply human in this endless courting of danger. We dig into the dark to find what shines. We know the risk, but we can't stop reaching for the glitter. The sparkle blinds us to the pain beneath it. The mines collapse, the workers die, the hands tremble, but the necklaces gleam beneath chandeliers, and the world applauds. And if you think we've learned, look closer at your own adornments. Nickel earrings that blister the skin, cheap alloys that leach lead, vintage rings glowing faintly under ultraviolet light. The poisons are smaller now, more refined, but they're still there, polite, invisible, patient. Beauty, it seems, always wants something in return. When the miners died coughing blood, they were forgotten, but the diamonds they found now rest in velvet boxes, untarnished, eternal. Their brightness is borrowed from the lives they consumed. Each jewel a memory, each shimmer a ghost. So next time you see a gem sparkle, remember this: the earth never gives without taking. Every stone is a wound made visible. And now our tale of deadly adornments gives way to another chapter of fashion's cruelty. Not the jewels we wear, but the shoes that crippled, the heels that broke bones, and the fabrics that burned faster than screams. The next part of our dark runway, the fashion of pain. Every century has its own language of suffering. In some, it was spoken in whispers of corsets and arsenic powders. In others, in the gleam of radium and the shimmer of poisoned gowns. But the truest, most intimate agony of fashion was born where the body met the garment, where elegance turned into endurance, and pain was renamed poise. They said beauty required sacrifice. They never mentioned how much. It began with shoes, simple, innocent shoes, stitched leather, carved heels, gilded buckles. But by the 16th century, shoes had become instruments of torment. The aristocracy demanded height. The taller the heel, the greater the grace, the closer to heaven, or at least to the throne. In Venice, noble women walked the streets on chopines, platform shoes so tall they resembled stilts. Some rose over 20 inches from heel to ground. They could not walk alone. 2 servants were required to hold their arms as they glided forward, trembling above the cobblestones like marionettes. Falls were frequent. Bones snapped beneath satin skirts. Doctors of the time described broken ankles as accidents of vanity. The women smiled through the pain. Limping was simply another form of luxury. Elsewhere, in China, beauty took a crueler turn. For nearly 1,000 years, girls had their feet broken and bound to fit the poetic ideal of the lotus foot. At 5 or 6 years old, the bones of their toes were crushed, folded beneath the sole, and bound tightly with cloth until the feet resembled hooves. The runes festered, infections set in, the smell of rot mingled with perfume, and yet men wrote poems about their beauty. The smaller the foot, the larger the desire, they said. No woman with natural feet could marry into wealth. And so generation after generation was reshaped in the name of grace.
Europe was no less brutal. In the 18th and 19th centuries, women wore gowns supported by crinolines, steel-hooped cages that gave the illusion of ethereal lightness. From afar, they floated like clouds. Up close, they clanked like armor. The crinoline had a habit of turning against its wearer. In crowded ballrooms, women were crushed between skirts. In narrow doorways, they became trapped. And worst of all, when the fabric brushed a candle, it became a torch. Newspapers from London to New York told of women who burned alive in seconds, their skirts exploding into flame. The sound of silk on fire was said to resemble laughter. Over 3,000 such deaths were recorded in the mid-1800s. One actress, Clara Webster, caught fire during a performance and died before the curtain fell. The crowd thought it part of the show. The crinoline was eventually abandoned, not because it was lethal, but because it was no longer in style. Then came the girdle, the descendant of the corset. It promised modernity, a mechanical miracle that slimmed without suffocating. In truth, it was simply a corset with better advertising. Elastic and rubber replaced whalebone, but the intent remained the same: to flatten, to mold, to silence. By the 1940s, millions of women stepped into girdles each morning, pulling them tight until their flesh surrendered. Doctors documented fainting spells, varicose veins, miscarriages. But magazines printed only smiles. Beauty, wrote Vogue in 1947, is discipline made visible. And the world believed it.
Not every cruelty came from industry. Some came from choice, or what the world told us was choice. Pierced ears became infected from nickel-laced alloys. Plastic surgery promised perfection and delivered paralysis. Modern heels still reshape the spine, the knees, the tendons. Every red carpet hides the same choreography of endurance. The subtle tremor of legs locked in impossible shoes, the breath caught under tight fabric, the smile that never shows the ache beneath. We call it glamour, but it's the same ritual our ancestors knew. Pain, painted and perfumed
until it looks divine. The greatest cruelty of fashion has never been the poison, or the metal, or the flame. It's the belief that beauty and pain are twins, that to be admired one must first suffer, that elegance must hurt or it isn't real. The corset broke bones, the crinoline burned flesh, the heel twisted spines, the girdle compressed organs. And yet, across centuries, the refrain never changed. This is what beauty requires. Even today, we hear its echo in the most modern of languages. Just a little discomfort. It's worth it. Beauty is pain. It is the oldest lie ever whispered in a mirror. Next, the story shifts from what people wore to where they worked. The dark factories that turned fashion into a massacre. The year was 1911. Manhattan glittered with new ambition, steel towers rising, lights burning late, and dreams stitched from fabric and sweat. On the corner of Green Street and Washington Place stood the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, a name that sounded almost elegant. Inside, it was anything but. The factory occupied the top 3 floors of a 10-story building. Rows of women, immigrants mostly, young and hungry, bent over sewing machines. They worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Needles flicked, scissors snipped, and the air was heavy with dust and lint. There were no fans, no ventilation. The windows were sealed shut to keep out the chill, and to keep the girls from taking breaks. They were paid by the piece. The faster they sewed, the more they earned. A dropped thread, a pause, a sigh. Each meant less money. The foreman watched with hawk eyes, pacing between the rows.
Every movement, every breath was measured in pennies. And somewhere beneath all that pressure, someone dropped a cigarette. It fell into a bin of fabric scraps, thin, dry, electric, with static. Within seconds, a flame. Within a minute, a storm. The fire leapt from table to table, feeding on cotton, on gauze, on silk. The air itself began to burn. Panic erupted. Girls screamed, ran for the doors, but the doors were locked. The owners had sealed them to prevent theft and unauthorized breaks. There was one key, kept by a supervisor who had already fled. They clawed at the windows, coughing through black smoke. The stairwells were flames. The elevators jammed after a few frantic trips. The fire reached the ceilings. The machines melted into puddles. And then the first bodies fell. Women jumped from the 9th floor to the pavement below, their dresses flaring like wings. Witnesses said it looked like rain, a terrible, silent rain of fire and fabric. People on the street fainted. Police shouted for nets, but the bodies tore through them like paper. 146 workers died that afternoon, most of them girls under 20. Their ashes stained the gutters. Their names filled newspaper columns for weeks. The owners were tried for manslaughter. They were acquitted. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire became a scar the world could no longer hide. Photos of the charred factory floor appeared on front pages across America. For the first time, fashion looked in the mirror and saw blood. The public outrage was immense. Unions formed. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union marched in the streets, demanding safety, dignity, breath. New laws followed: fire escapes, sprinklers, unlocked exits, fair wages. But for every reform, there were hundreds of factories that ignored them. The dresses still had to be made, the profit still had to flow. It wasn't the first fire, and it wouldn't be the last.
Decades later, the same story repeated in new cities, under new names. In Bangladesh, 2012, The Tazreen fashion factory went up in flames. Another locked door, another 100 bodies. In Pakistan, 2012, 289 workers burned in the Ali Enterprises factory. In Dhaka, 2013, the Rana Plaza collapsed, burying more than 1,000 garment workers beneath rubble. Every disaster echoed the same sound, the rustle of cheap fabric and the silence of corporate apology. We told ourselves it was tragedy, but it wasn't tragedy. It was tradition. Fashion had always fed on sacrifice. Before, it was the poison of silk, the bite of corsets, the shimmer of arsenic-green. Now it was labor, the invisible deaths behind every hemline and label. The rich still wore beauty. The poor still paid for it. And in the middle, the mirror still lied. There's a bitter truth hidden in the ashes of the Triangle Factory. Every era believes it has outgrown cruelty, but cruelty simply learns to sew faster. It trades whalebone for polyester, arsenic for pesticides, servants for sweatshops. It updates its vocabulary, never its morals. So when you open your closet, listen closely. The fabric may whisper. It may tell you a story of hands that stitch through heat, hunger, and smoke. A story that began with fire and still burns quietly beneath the seams. By the mid-20th century, the world had survived wars, seen empires crumble, and stepped into a new kingdom ruled by convenience. Silk, cotton, and wool, materials that once required time, labor, and care, suddenly seemed old-fashioned. The future shimmered with something new: plastic. Fashion called it progress. Industry called it profit. But beneath that glossy surface, the planet began to choke.
In 1935, a chemist named Wallace Carruthers at DuPont invented nylon, a thread spun not from nature, but from petroleum. It was flexible, strong, and cheap. When the first nylon stockings appeared, they sold out in hours. Women called them miracle legs. Advertisers promised they'd never run, never tear, never age. They lied, of course, but the spell worked. Soon came polyester, acrylic, rayon, spandex, a rainbow of names that sounded like science fiction. Every fiber was a triumph of chemistry and capitalism. Designers rejoiced. Clothes became lighter, faster to produce, easier to clean. Fashion was democratized, and that democracy was built on oil. Plastic fabric had one great virtue: it refused to die. A nylon blouse could last forever. A polyester dress could survive a generation. It was immortality woven into fabric. The irony was terrible. While the women who wore them aged, the dresses stayed young. But immortality comes at a price. Unlike silk or cotton, plastic never decays. It only breaks apart, turning into microfibers that drift through air and water. Every wash, every spin of a machine releases thousands of tiny threads that flow into rivers, oceans, and eventually the human bloodstream. The beauty that once killed individuals now poisons the species. Synthetic fashion demanded new temples, giant refineries and chemical plants. Workers handled solvents that melted skin, inhaled vapors that scarred lungs. By the 1970s, polyester dominated closets across continents. Wash and wear, the ad said, wrinkle-free and worry-free. But the fumes that produced that comfort caused cancer clusters in the towns built around the factories. The irony deepened when PVC, once hailed as the fabric of the future, was found to release dioxins, some of the most toxic compounds known to science. Designers used it for raincoats, handbags, even corsets. They called it modern armor. Models fainted on runways when the garments trapped body heat. No one questioned it. The audience clapped. Then came the age of fast fashion. Synthetic fibers made clothing so cheap that it lost meaning. Dresses were worn once for a photograph, then discarded. Every landfill became a museum of forgotten trends. The colors, brilliant, synthetic, eternal, bled into soil and sea. Fish absorbed them, birds carried them, and soon those same molecules appeared on dinner plates, in bottled water, even in the air we breathe. Every breath, every meal, every wave now contains the ghosts of yesterday's wardrobes.
The industry saw the headlines and adapted, not with humility, but with rebranding. Eco-polyester, recycled nylon, vegan leather. The words glittered like salvation, yet most were illusions. Recycled plastic still sheds microfibers. Vegan leather is still PVC. The cycle repeats under greener lights. Meanwhile, the workers in Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Ethiopia still stitch the same synthetic fabrics, still inhale the same fumes, still earn barely enough to live. The poison simply moved farther from the eyes that buy them. There is something haunting about the way synthetic fashion feels. Too smooth, too perfect, a little too quiet. It doesn't breathe, doesn't wrinkle, doesn't age. It is the dream of immortality turned tactile. But when you wear it, your skin knows. It sweats differently. It remembers that it was meant to touch life, not oil. Some dermatologists now call it polyester dermatitis. Rashes, itching, suffocation of the pores. A body rejecting its artificial second skin. Open your wardrobe at night when the house is silent. Listen closely. You can almost hear it. The faint rustle of plastic pretending to be fabric. The slow sigh of threads that will outlive you. A single polyester dress can take 400 years to decompose. That's 20 generations of human lives. 20 generations breathing the dust of one outfit. We once dreamed of silk that shimmered forever. Now we have it, and it is strangling the planet that birthed us. Plastic fashion promised liberation from nature. It delivered dependence on oil, pollution, and the illusion of convenience. It replaced the quiet death of poison with the long death of permanence. The dresses don't kill their wearers anymore. They kill slowly, invisibly, across oceans and centuries. The runway of history glows brighter than ever. LED lights, digital screens, holographic models. Yet beneath all that brilliance, the pattern remains unchanged. Every age believes it has tamed death, and every age proves itself wrong. Color has always been the soul of fashion. From the green of envy to the crimson of desire, we've worshipped hue like religion. Yet the history of color is not written in paint or pigment. It's written in poisoned rivers, in blue foam, in the silence of fish. Once, color was the dream of beauty. Now, it is the shadow that stains the earth. The story begins in the 19th century, when synthetic dyes first appeared. Before then, every color came from nature, crushed plants, minerals, even insects. Indigo from leaves, red from the cochineal beetle, purple from sea snails harvested by the thousands,
The process was slow, sacred, and expensive. Then came William Henry Perkin, an 18-year-old chemist who, in 1856, accidentally discovered the first synthetic dye while trying to create a cure for malaria. The result was Movine, a brilliant violet that refused to fade. It changed fashion forever. Every dress, every curtain, every scarf could now blaze with color once reserved for royalty. London, Paris, and Berlin turned into laboratories of beauty. But behind the revolution of hue was a new darkness, aniline dyes, made from coal tar and toxic metals. The rivers that once reflected the sky began to reflect the seasons palette instead. One month they ran blue, the next red, then green, black, and finally gray with death. By the early 1900s, textile factories lined the banks of Europe's great rivers, the Thames, the Seine, the Rhine. They dumped everything: lead, mercury, arsenic, chromium. The water shimmered, not with sunlight, but with chemical bloom. Workers joked that they could tell the fashionable color of Paris by the shade of the river each week. Fish floated belly up. Children bathed in dye. Cows refused to drink. But fashion marched on, dazzling and blind. When the aristocrats looked into their mirrors, they didn't see the filth behind the fabric. They saw luxury, radiance, prestige. Across the ocean, America joined the feast of color. Textile mills in New England and New Jersey poured waste into streams that fed entire towns. The people downstream called it the rainbow water. They didn't know it was laced with benzidine, a carcinogen that would later be banned. Too late for the generations who drank it. As the 20th century advanced, color found new homes. When Western nations began enforcing pollution laws, the dye houses moved to India, to China, to Bangladesh. There, rivers became canvases for global fashion. The Citarum River in Indonesia is one of the most polluted waterways on Earth. More than 400 textile factories line its banks. Its surface glows neon blue, then black, then red. People wash, cook, and drink from it still. Tests show the water contains lead, arsenic, and cadmium, levels thousands of times beyond safety. In one village, babies are born with yellow eyes. The color never fades. In China's Pearl River Delta, the hub of denim production, the same story unfolds. The world's jeans, the symbol of freedom and rebellion, are washed and dyed in waters that can no longer sustain life. The dye, indigo sulfonate, mixes with bleach and solvents until the rivers themselves look like liquid denim. For every pair of jeans, an estimated 7,000 liters of water are poisoned. The earth doesn't wear fashion, it absorbs it.
In the 21st century, brands began to fear their own reflection. They spoke of eco-friendly dyes, closed-loop systems, sustainable color. But the truth is harder to wash out. Even the most modern dyeing processes use vast amounts of energy and water. The clean factories of today often outsource their dirtiest stages to places where regulations are dreams, not laws. And while the rivers choke, the ads keep glowing. Vibrant new hues, they proclaim. Conscious couture, they promise. But every new shade of blue or crimson is still mixed with the old ingredients: denial and sacrifice. The dyes no longer stay in rivers, they come back to us. They seep into crops irrigated by tainted water, into fish, into air. Scientists now find traces of textile dye compounds in human tissue samples across the world. We have become part of the color wheel. What once stained silk
now stains our DNA. Color has always been about identity, who we are, what we desire. The red of power, the black of mourning, the white of purity. It seduces because it speaks directly to emotion, bypassing reason. That's why it's so dangerous. The rivers died quietly, without ceremony, no funeral, no outrage, just the slow, colorful drowning of ecosystems. And still, humanity kept painting itself in the very pigments that destroyed its reflection. We didn't just dye fabric, we dyed the future. In some places, the damage cannot be undone. The soil itself glows faintly in ultraviolet light, a residue of the dyes that never broke down. Children play on banks where nothing grows, their laughter echoing through air heavy with invisible chemicals. Their toys, their clothes, their dreams, all tinted by the same poison. A woman washing clothes in a toxic river once told a reporter, "The water burns my skin, but if I stop, we don't eat." That sentence is the entire history of fashion, written in one breath.
If you stand by a dyed river today, the surface looks like glass. You can see your reflection, clear, trembling, unreal. You might notice how the blue is too bright, the red too sharp. You might even think it's beautiful. And that's the tragedy. Because beauty, when mixed with greed, always finds a way to disguise its crimes. The rivers once ran blue. Now they run silent. And as the water flows toward the sea, it carries with it the memory of every dress, every uniform, every trend. The ocean is the final archive of fashion, and it is filling fast. There was a time when mirrors told the truth, a time when reflection meant recognition, when a person looked at their face and saw a life, not a flaw. That time is gone. The 20th century took the mirror, polished it until it lied, and sold the lie back to us wrapped in light. The mirror was once a household object. By the 1920s, it had become an altar. Film stars smiled from screens, their faces smooth and symmetrical, their beauty impossible yet required. Cosmetic companies saw the hunger in the eyes of ordinary women. They whispered a promise. You can look like her. And thus the mirror factory was born. Not a real place, but a machine built from commerce, chemistry, and desire. Magazines, billboards, and films all worked together, turning reflection into performance. A woman's value no longer came from her voice or mind, but how close her face could come to the dream projected at her. By the 1950s, beauty had become an industry of measurement. Every cheekbone, every waist, every pore had a standard. Perfection was not natural, it was manufactured. And for those who could not fit, science offered a way in. Cosmetic surgery began as medicine, for soldiers wounded in war, for burn victims, for those disfigured by accident. But soon it became a luxury service. The same techniques that rebuilt lives were now used to reshape youth. Facelifts, nose jobs, breast augmentations, all marketed as liberation through transformation. The early operations were crude: ether for anesthesia, scalpel scars that healed badly, infections that disfigured rather than beautified. Yet women lined up anyway. They had already been taught that the only thing worse than pain was imperfection.
By the 1970s, silicone became the new miracle. Doctors called it safe. Models called it salvation. But the truth leaked, literally. Implants ruptured, poisoning bloodstreams and collapsing dreams. Still, the clinics stayed full. When the digital camera arrived, the mirror multiplied. Now everyone could see themselves from every angle, under every light. The gaze became constant, obsessive, cruel. Then came the filters.
tiny programs that blurred skin, sharpened eyes, reshaped noses, tools that promised to enhance, but in truth erased humanity. Perfection was no longer a standard, it was an algorithm. And like all algorithms, it learned from our insecurities. We stopped looking at mirrors to see ourselves. We looked to check how far we were from the version of ourselves we had invented. Behind every screen there are factories, different from the ones that made fabric, but no less brutal. They mine data instead of coal. They refine faces instead of silk. They turn human emotion into profit. Cosmetic apps analyze millions of faces every day, learning what people hate about themselves and selling them the cure. The data feeds the beauty industry, the diet industry, the surgery industry. Each click refines the illusion. Each scroll sharpens the blade. We are all workers now, unpaid laborers in the mirror factory. We polish the image with every selfie, every edit, every share.
The cruelty of modern beauty is subtle. It doesn't burn the skin, it burns the mind. The arsenic and mercury of the past have become dopamine and despair. Instead of corsets, we have calorie counters. Instead of arsenic-green, we have ring lights and retouching. Studies now show that image-based apps have led to record levels of anxiety, depression, and body dysmorphia, especially among the young. They grow up surrounded by reflections that never blink, never age, never err. How could the real face ever compete? Plastic surgeons now speak of a new diagnosis: Snapchat dysmorphia. Patients who bring filtered selfies to consultations asking to look like their digital ghosts. They want smoother skin, larger eyes, smaller noses. They want to erase time itself. They want to become what the mirror factory promised them. And the machines are learning to oblige. Today, algorithms generate perfect faces, symmetrical, poreless, ageless. Fashion brands use AI models that don't eat, don't age, don't speak. Some influencers aren't real at all, just pixels in dresses made of pixels. They get endorsements, followers, interviews. They never tire, never demand wages, never bleed. The mirror factory has achieved its purest form, beauty without a body. But the cost remains. Every image demands electricity, computation, surveillance. Every post burns a little more carbon, a little more sanity. We have traded mirrors of glass for mirrors of code, and both reflect our longing to be loved. Look closely at your reflection in a screen. Notice how the light from the pixels dances in your pupils. That's the modern version of the arsenic sheen that once shimmered on a Victorian gown. It's beautiful. It's deadly. It's addictive. If history has taught anything, it is that beauty always finds a way to disguise violence as devotion. The mirror factory is only the newest version of that old religion. We still kneel before it. We still pray to be chosen. But every religion eventually faces its reckoning. Mirrors crack, filters fail, truth leaks through. And when it does, we may finally see that perfection was never the goal, only the weapon. The age of reflection has made us luminous and hollow, flawless and fragile. We no longer die from the poisons we wear, we die from the reflections we chase. They called them elixirs, tonics, miracle waters. The promise was ancient and irresistible. Drink and be transformed. For centuries, humanity searched for beauty in bottles, believing that what the skin could not perfect, the stomach could. But every sip had its shadow. The same hands that poured dreams into glass also poured arsenic, mercury, lead, opium, and even radioactive dust. The taste of beauty was sweet until it wasn't. In the mid-1800s, travelers in Austria and Styria told strange stories of peasants who glowed with unusual vitality. Their skin was pale but luminous, their eyes bright, their breath strangely sweet. When asked their secret, they confessed they ate arsenic. Not by accident, by devotion. They believed small doses of poison cleansed the blood, brightened the complexion, and made them resistant to disease. At first, it worked, or seemed to. The skin flushed with color, the pulse quickened, the cheeks burned with false health. Then came the second stage: nausea, trembling, and sudden death. Doctors tried to warn them, but vanity is louder than reason. Soon the practice spread across Europe's upper classes. Pharmacies sold arsenic wafers for the skin, delicate tablets of powdered poison often marketed under names like Dr. James Complexion Beautifier or the Enchantress Pill. Advertisements promised a pure, translucent glow without the fatigue of cosmetics. They were not lying. The glow was real. It came from the slow decay of the body. By the late 19th century, mercury chloride, also known as corrosive sublimate, became the secret ingredient in dozens of beauty restoratives. It erased wrinkles by inflaming the skin, forcing it to shed and renew itself. It was sold as a tonic, mixed into complexion waters or revitalizing syrups. Drink a spoonful each morning, the label said, and youth would return. Instead, it returned trembling hands, split tongues, blackened gums. Some went mad. Others simply faded, their minds and bodies dissolving in silence. But the manufacturers were protected by prestige. The poisons were dressed in porcelain jars and sold in perfumed shops. The paradox of beauty was complete. The more the world adored youth, the faster it found ways to destroy it. Then came the most radiant lie of all. In the early 1900s, after the discovery of radium, science and fashion merged into a deadly romance. The age worshipped the glow. The newspapers called it the light of life. Companies bottled that light into cosmetics and tonics, Radiathor, Thoradia, radial water. Each sip was said to awaken the body's atomic energy. It didn't just promise youth, it promised immortality. One advertisement showed a woman smiling beside a glowing flask. Radiance you can drink. The drink was literal light, and it burned from within. Users lost teeth, then jaws, then life. The most famous victim? Eben Byers, a millionaire playboy, drank 3 bottles of Radiathor a day. When he died in 1932, his bones were so radioactive that his coffin had to be sealed in lead. His obituary headline read, "The radium water worked fine until his jaw came off." Even after his death, similar tonics stayed on the market for years. Because beauty, like belief, doesn't surrender easily. In the early 1900s, women faced a new enemy: weight. As corsets loosened and silhouettes changed, thinness became the measure of grace.
And so pharmacies offered diet tonics, syrups laced with opium, belladonna, and cocaine. The ingredients dulled hunger, elevated mood, and sharpened focus. They also rewired the brain, creating addictions that outlasted beauty itself.
In Paris, laudanum luncheons became fashionable. Women would skip meals and sip opium-laced tea instead, floating through afternoons on waves of euphoria. By the time withdrawal came, shaking, sweating, sobbing, the price of elegance was already paid. When external creams couldn't deliver, science turned inward again. By the 1930s, a new horror appeared: internal skin whiteners. Tablets and syrups containing hydroquinone, phenol, or chlorine compounds promised to lighten the complexion from the inside out. Women drank bleach diluted with honey and milk. Doctors warned of internal burns and kidney failure. The advertisements countered with a smile. Beauty is worth any taste. For some, the taste was metallic. For others, it was the last thing they ever felt. By the mid-20th century, regulations had improved. The bottles changed shape, the poisons changed names, but the promise stayed identical. Detox water, metabolic elixir, anti-aging infusion. Today, the drinks no longer glow, but they still deceive. The miracle tonics of Instagram, collagen boosters, miracle teas, detox juices followed the same script as the arsenic wafers and radium bottles. They sell salvation through the mouth. They promise transformation through chemistry. And most of all, they trade on fear. Fear of time, of change, of being seen as ordinary. There's a moment that connects every century of beauty. The pause before swallowing. The moment when a hand hovers above a cup or bottle, knowing and not knowing what it contains. It's a sacred ritual of surrender, the faith that death can be outwitted by design. Every generation drinks from the same chalice, each believing its poison is progress. The ancients sought immortality in gold and mercury. The Victorians swallowed arsenic. The moderns drink collagen and call it science. Different bottles, same thirst. In the end, beauty has always been about consumption. What we eat, what we apply, what we inhale. It is hunger dressed as glamour. The poisons were only ever reflections of the deeper craving, to escape the body itself. And so, from the deadly powders and elixirs, the story now turns to the body's final disguise, the clothes we choose to die in, the fabrics woven for mourning, and the rituals that made death fashionable.
The story of fashion does not end with life. Even in death, it demands an audience. When the body turns cold and breath fades to silence, fabric remains, black, heavy, elegant. For centuries, death was not the end of beauty, but its final performance. In the 19th century, grief had rules. It was not enough to suffer. You had to display it. Queen Victoria, after the death of Prince Albert in 1861, dressed in black for 40 years. The world followed her example. Mourning became a uniform, an etiquette, an industry. Every stage of grief had its fabric. Fresh widows wore dull black bombazine and crepe, a material so matte it absorbed light itself. After a year, they could progress to silk or jet jewelry, black glass that glittered like frozen tears. 2 years later came half mourning, when gray, lilac, and lavender were permitted. The transition from despair to acceptance was measured not in tears, but in tone. Stores like Jay's Mourning Warehouse in London sold everything: dresses, gloves, hats,
handkerchiefs, even stationery, all in black. Grief had become a market. The preferred fabric of mourning, crepe, was cruel. It was stiff, brittle, and abrasive. The dyeing process soaked it in lead acetate and arsenic to achieve its dead matte finish. Women developed skin ulcers where the fabric touched their necks. Their lungs filled with microscopic black dust. They coughed blood into their veils. Yet society praised them for their devotion. To refuse the dress of mourning was not courage, it was scandal. A woman could lose her reputation faster than her husband. Every accessory had meaning. A widow's veil, called the weeping veil, covered her face completely, a barrier between her and the living. It was said to protect her from evil spirits, but in truth, it served to make her invisible. Women wore veils for months or years, their world reduced to shadows and whispers.
The black veil became a paradox, both a prison and a shield. It hid the tears, but also trapped the air. The tightly woven crepe made breathing difficult, especially under gaslight or summer sun. Many women fainted during funerals. Some collapsed in the street. But fainting, like suffering, was fashionable. If death had a wardrobe, it also had jewelry. Mourning ornaments were made of jet, a fossilized coal that gleamed like obsidian. Others were crafted from human hair, braided, woven, or pressed beneath glass. Brooches, rings, and lockets often contained a lock of the deceased's hair pressed against a photograph or a scrap of handwriting. To wear such a piece was to carry a ghost. The Victorians did not fear the dead, they wore them. Some artisans offered more morbid luxuries, rings set with teeth, necklaces containing bone dust. Collectors prized them, priests condemned them, but grief has always been stronger than doctrine. Mourning had become theater, an elegant performance where sorrow was choreographed and style replaced sincerity. The black dress was both costume and confession. Women were judged by the quality of their sorrow as much as the cut of their gown. Society loved tragedy, provided it was well dressed. Poets praised widows for their dignified sadness. Pain was aestheticized, photographed, printed. Mourning portraits showed families dressed in perfect black, faces pale, eyes bright with controlled despair. Even death had to look composed. By the late 19th century, the mourning industry rivaled fashion itself. Specialized magazines advertised funeral chic and elegant bereavement. Tailors competed to create gowns that blended grief with allure. The veil grew longer, the gloves tighter, the sorrow more elaborate. And beneath it all, the workers who dyed and sewed the fabric coughed themselves to death, inhaling toxic fumes from black dyes. The irony was perfect. Mourning garments killed the living faster than time itself.
By the 20th century, mourning fashion began to fade. 2 world wars made grief too common to costume. Black lost its sanctity. It became a color of rebellion, art, power. The veil was lifted, the theater closed. But something of it remains. The luxury brands of today still borrow its language: elegant minimalism, noir chic, funereal couture. Runways still echo with the ghost of the mourning dress, the long lines, the shadows, the whispered silk. Grief has simply been rebranded. Even now, we dress for death without realizing it. We wear black to funerals, to parties, to galleries. It flatters, it conceals, it commands respect. We think it's sophistication, but it's inheritance, fashion's most enduring relic.
The mourning veil has become a metaphor. We live behind digital veils now, filters, masks, curated identities. We hide from reality the way Victorians hid from grief. Different fabric, same fear. In the end, the mourning dress wasn't about death at all. It was about control, the belief that even sorrow could be tamed, disciplined, made beautiful. It was the last attempt to civilize chaos, to make despair elegant. But death does not care for etiquette. It comes quietly, indifferent to color or cloth, and when it does, the veil falls for everyone. Every palace had its perfumes, its mirrors, its silk and gold. But behind the glitter and ceremony lay a darker luxury, poison. In royal courts, beauty and death shared the same table. The same hands that anointed kings also stirred their chalices. The same jewels that adorned queens hid tiny compartments filled with venom. Power was fragile, and fashion was its disguise.
Italy, 16th century. The Medici family ruled not just through gold and marriage, but through chemistry. Their court perfumer, Tofana of Palermo, was said to have created a potion so perfect it could kill without trace. It was clear as water, sweet as perfume, and deadly as confession. They called it aqua tofana. She sold it in glass vials marked as holy water or face lotion. Noble women kept it among their cosmetics. A drop in wine, soup, or kiss was enough to erase a husband or rival. Dozens died with their last breath scented by roses. When Tofana was caught, she confessed calmly to killing more than 600 people. Her final words before execution were simple: "I only helped them live the lives they wanted." Poison, after all, was freedom, especially for women who had none. In France, at the height of Louis XIV's reign, elegance was law. Every meal was a performance, every dress a declaration. But beneath the silks, envy festered. At court, a misplaced word could cost your life, and so the affair of the poisons began. From 1677 to 1682, Paris was haunted by whispers of witchcraft. Fortune-tellers sold love potions, priests blessed poisons, and noblewomen attended secret black masses to rid themselves of husbands and rivals. The most notorious, Madame de Montespan, the king's mistress, was accused of using poison and charms to maintain his love. Her servants confessed to mixing arsenic and ground bones into powders hidden among her perfumes. When the king's court investigated, over 300 people were implicated: courtiers, soldiers, midwives, and priests. Some were executed, others quietly vanished. The scandal nearly collapsed the monarchy. And yet the king's wardrobe grew richer, the banquets brighter, as though beauty itself could drown out the stench of corruption. Royalty understood that poison was an art. Assassination had to be invisible, elegant. A knife was vulgar. Poison was divine. Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, wore rings with tiny hidden needles. One prick, one handshake, and an enemy would die within days. Elizabethan courtiers laced gloves with mercury salts and powdered arsenic. A fashionable handshake could be fatal. Even makeup became a weapon. Ceruse, the white lead face paint, served both beauty and murder. Applied daily, it killed slowly enough to be confused with sorrow or grief. Poison made death indistinguishable from disease. At every royal table sat a taster, a living shield who sampled every dish before the monarch. It was the most dangerous form of employment. One mistake, one impatient sip, and the taster's devotion ended in silence.
But poisons grew smarter. They were mixed into inks, candles, gloves, even letters. The mere act of writing could kill. In the Russian court of the 18th century, the secret police under the czars maintained entire laboratories devoted to toxin research. They called it the Laboratory of Death. The most famous victim was Prince Golitsyn, who died after accepting a perfumed snuff box. His face turned blue before he could finish his sentence. Poison, however, was not only a weapon, it was fashion. The same alchemists who created cosmetics for queens also crafted their venoms. In 18th century France, the perfume called Eau Admirable was rumored to contain a trace of belladonna, deadly nightshade, because it dilated the pupils, giving the eyes a soft, romantic glow. Too much, and the heart stopped. Ladies of the court painted their lips with carmine made from crushed insects mixed with mercury. They called it vitality. History calls it murder by vanity. To be a poisoner was to be an artist of patience. The ideal poison killed not immediately, but gracefully, over days, even weeks. It mimicked illness, left no stain, no bruise, no wound. The most skilled poisoners knew exactly how much to administer, enough to kill, never enough to cause suspicion. Some were scientists, some were servants. All were invisible.
As science advanced, forensic chemistry caught up. Poison, once the silent power behind thrones, began to lose its invisibility. By the 19th century, arsenic could be detected, mercury identified, and cyanide traced. The art of the poisoner faded, at least officially, but the idea of poison lingered in fashion itself. Lead in lipstick, arsenic in fabric, mercury in hats. Royalty had simply taught the world how to die beautifully. Perhaps that is the cruelest legacy of the royal poisoners. They proved that the pursuit of beauty and the lust for power are born from the same root, the desire to control. To control others, to control fate, to control decay. The courtiers of Versailles and the queens of Florence may be gone, but their descendants live on in laboratories, marketing boards, and cosmetic factories. Their poisons wear new names, sold with smiles instead of secrets. History, it seems, never stopped sipping from the same cup. And so, from the gilded corridors of palaces and the shimmer of death and perfume, our story moves to the seas, where even ships bore the mark of fashion and curse. The sea has always been a mirror. It reflects glory, greed, and fear in equal measure. For centuries, humanity has looked upon its dark surface and seen opportunity, a stage where empires proved their might, explorers courted immortality, and luxuries sailed with arrogance. But the ocean remembers. It swallows pride whole. And some ships, it seems, were born cursed, too grand, too perfect, too vain to survive their own reflection. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, technology made humanity believe it could conquer nature. Steam replaced sails, steel replaced wood, and man believed he could tame the sea. Shipbuilders competed not in safety, but in splendor. Each vessel had to be larger, brighter, more opulent than the last, floating cathedrals of excess. The most infamous of these was RMS Titanic, a name that still tastes like salt and sorrow. They called her unsinkable, a word so full of hubris that even the sea must have laughed. She glittered with chandeliers, marble staircases, and velvet parlors. Passengers dined on crystal and silver as the orchestra played. When she struck ice on April 14, 1912, the world watched civilization sink beneath the Atlantic. Her tragedy was not just an accident, it was prophecy. Every detail spoke of mankind's obsession with image over humility. There were lifeboats for barely half the people aboard, because lifeboats would have spoiled the view. The ship was built to be beautiful, not safe, and in the dark, freezing water, beauty meant nothing. But Titanic was not alone in her fate. Throughout history, ships of grandeur have carried their own doom, as if cursed by their maker's pride. In the 17th century, Sweden launched the Vasa, a warship meant to be the most magnificent vessel ever built. She was carved with gilded lions and painted gods, towering with 2 gun decks that gleamed like a floating palace. On her maiden voyage in 1628, she sailed barely a mile before a gust of wind tipped her onto her side. Water rushed through the open gun ports. She sank before the royal family's eyes, taking dozens with her. When divers raised her centuries later, her hull was almost perfectly preserved, a tomb of vanity. The reason for the disaster was simple: too much beauty, too little balance. Not all curses sink in an instant. Some linger, refusing to rest. The Mary Celeste, launched in 1861, became the most famous ghost ship in history. Found adrift near the Azores in 1872, her sails were full, her cargo intact, her log updated. But her crew was gone. No blood, no struggle, just absence. Rumors spread like waves: mutiny, sea monsters, divine punishment. Others whispered that the ship herself was cursed, destined to wander until she claimed enough souls to satisfy the sea. In truth, no one knows what happened. And perhaps that's the point. Some mysteries prefer to remain afloat. By the mid-20th century, the curse took a modern form. Warships became floating nations, luxury liners became temples of wealth, and oil tankers became moving fortresses of industry. But even progress carried superstition. The Andrea Doria, an Italian liner hailed as the most beautiful ship ever built after World War II, was said to carry the pride of a reborn nation. In 1956, she collided with another vessel off the coast of Nantucket and sank in a matter of hours. Her marble staircases and murals still rest beneath the sea, ghostly and perfect. Divers who enter her wreck speak of an eerie calm, corridors still lined with cutlery and clocks that stopped at the exact minute she died. They call her the Lady of the Deep, and like the Titanic, she remains proof that even rebirth can be haunted by memory.
Every age builds ships to reflect itself. Medieval kings built armadas of conquest. Industrial barons built floating cities of class division. The modern world builds cruise ships the size of small towns, glittering towers of entertainment drifting across a dying ocean. Each reflects the same dream, that luxury can protect us from consequence. But the ocean has no hierarchy. When it takes equally, the rich and poor alike. If you look closely at the stories of these doomed ships, you'll see a pattern. Every one of them was called unsinkable, invincible, perfect. And perfection in history is always a curse. The Greeks had a word for it: hubris, the belief that human creation could rival the gods. The sea has always been the punishment for that belief. It is vast, ancient, and indifferent, the one mirror we can never polish. Today's ships are built with satellite navigation, fireproof walls, and digital surveillance. But the curse persists. Every few years, headlines repeat the pattern. A liner capsizes, a ferry burns, a vessel vanishes. Each new disaster is met with the same old refrain: it was a freak accident. It could never happen again. Until it does. And as climate change stirs the oceans to fury, perhaps the ocean has decided to reclaim what arrogance stole. At the bottom of the ocean lie thousands of ships, resting in silence. Some still gleam with brass and silver, their cabins eerily preserved. Fish swim through grand dining halls. Seaweed grows over velvet chairs. The chandeliers still hang, swaying gently in the current as if waiting for guests who will never return. Each wreck is a museum of human pride, a cathedral of drowned beauty. Fashion built them to impress the world. The sea keeps them to remind it. The ocean never forgets. It holds our reflection longer than any mirror. And when we stare too long into that blue abyss, we see the truth that every age denies. Beauty built on arrogance will always sink.
The air in ancient churches is always colder than it should be. Stone walls hold centuries of breath and prayer. Candles flicker against gold and bone. And sometimes, just sometimes, the body inside the coffin has not rotted at all. The skin remains, thin as parchment. The eyes sunken but whole. The hands folded in eternal devotion. They called these bodies incorruptible, the saints who refused to decay. For the faithful, incorruptibility was proof of divine favor. If the body did not rot, it meant the soul was pure. Decay was punishment. Preservation was grace. The Church recorded hundreds of such cases. Saint Bernadette of Lourdes, Saint Catherine of Bologna, Saint Rita of Cassia, Saint Sylvan, whose serene face still lies behind glass, lips slightly parted as though whispering prayers to the centuries. Pilgrims knelt before them, convinced they were witnessing the victory of spirit over nature. But beneath the hymns and incense, another story whispered, a tale not of miracles, but of chemistry, ritual, and sometimes deception. When scientists finally examined many of the so-called incorruptibles, they found clues the faithful had missed. Some bodies were preserved not by heaven, but by the earth. Dry climates, mineral-rich soils, or sealed tombs had naturally slowed decay. Others had been treated with spices, wine, or oils, primitive embalming hidden beneath piety. Yet even science struggled to explain all of them. Some saints were buried in damp crypts, exposed to air and moisture, and still did not rot. Their skin turned waxy, but remained intact. The smell of roses, reported in several cases, was real, a byproduct of natural bacterial reactions. Faith saw sanctity. Science saw coincidence. Both agreed. Something extraordinary had happened.
By the 17th century, incorruptibility had become fashionable. Churches competed for relics. Every monastery wanted a saintly body, a symbol of divine connection and prestige. When authentic relics were scarce, the Vatican's catacomb saints filled the gap. These were skeletons exhumed from Roman catacombs, dressed in fine clothes and encrusted with jewels. Their bones were draped in gold thread, their skulls covered with wax masks shaped into serene faces. They were shipped across Europe and displayed in glass shrines. Faithful and fearful alike knelt before them, never realizing their incorruptible saints were carefully assembled mummies. The artisans who prepared them were masters of sacred illusion. They powdered skulls, painted veins onto wax, and adorned the skeletons with crowns and lace. These corpses were couture, designed to inspire awe, obedience, and donations. The Church understood the power of visible miracles. An incorruptible body could convert a village faster than any sermon. When a saint's tomb was opened and found intact, word spread like fire. Pilgrims flooded in. Markets grew around the shrine. Gold flowed where flesh refused to rot. Some clerics faked it.
They filled coffins with wax effigies, claiming them to be miraculously preserved remains. Others maintained real corpses with oils, resins, or even arsenic. The line between miracle and maintenance blurred until no one could tell the difference. To stand before an incorruptible saint is to feel something complicated. Part reverence, part unease. They lie beneath glass, clothed in silks that shimmer faintly, faces calm as sleep. But look closely, and you'll see the truth. The lips drawn tight, the hollow beneath the eyes, the faint dust gathering where once there was warmth. Their beauty is unnatural, preserved for centuries by human hands pretending to imitate divine will. They are relics and victims both, proof that even in death, the human body was never allowed peace.
Some incorruptibles showed strange transformations. Saint Catherine Labouraire's eyes, said to have retained their color decades after death. Saint Zita's body, exhumed after 300 years, still dressed in perfect linen. Saint Veronica Giuliani, whose heart, when cut open, was said to contain markings of Christ's wounds. For the devout, these were miracles. For skeptics, they were results of burial conditions or pious exaggeration. But both missed the deeper truth: belief itself preserves. Stories live longer than flesh. The saints survived because people needed them to. By the Victorian era, science had replaced saints, but the obsession with preservation endured. Embalming became fashionable. Formaldehyde, the new holy oil. The rich paid to look peaceful, untouched by decay. Photography turned corpses into portraits, the dead posed as if sleeping. In a way, the Victorians were just continuing the same ritual the church began. They couldn't accept death's impermanence, so they dressed it, perfumed it, and called it love. Today, you can still visit them. In Italy, Austria, France, and Spain, bodies lying in glass, their faces painted with eternal serenity. Tourists take photographs. Pilgrims press rosaries to the glass. The air smells faintly of incense and time. Some saints, like Bernadette, remain so intact that doctors admit bafflement. Others have been quietly replaced with wax models, the truth buried beneath devotion. But whether they are miracles or mummies hardly matters now. They have become part of our shared mythology, a reminder that even in death, humanity seeks control over decay.
The incorruptibles represent the final chapter of fashion's oldest dream, to defy nature. From poison dresses to radium creams, from corsets to chemicals, every age has tried to outwit the body. The saints succeeded, but at a cost. They were turned into objects, exhibited like trophies, stripped of their humanity in the name of holiness. In them, we see ourselves, our desperate wish to last, to glow, to be remembered, to be beautiful forever. But the truth is simpler, humbler, and more merciful. Nothing truly beautiful needs to last. And so our journey through the deadly fashions of history closes where it began, with the body, adorned, deceived, and worshipped. The next tale will be the epilogue, a reflection on why beauty and death have always walked hand in hand, and why, even now, we keep dressing for the grave.